Good morning, everybody. This is Ian Beale from CB. It's 11 o'clock. It's my pleasure to be kicking off this morning's webinar. We've got 60 minutes to talk about emerging risks. So, very warm welcome to everybody. This is the first webinar I've run for the IRM this year. So, welcome to this year's first webinar from me. But welcome back if you listen to one of my webinars. I've run many webinars for the IRM over the last few years. So welcome if it's your first time, welcome back if it's a repeat visit from you. So let's get going. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. So let's move on. How are we going to spend our time today? Really want to spend time in these areas. I'm going to say a few words of welcome and introduction, then give an exec summary, so give you the highlights from our Q1 emerging risk survey and report. Then we'll go into more detail and talk about the top 10 risks, what we're seeing from our global client network, and show you a little bit of analysis of those top 10 risks. And then we'll close with some further signpost to further information from how to access the deck, other information from us, and also some other information from the IRM. So in terms of introduction, my name is Ian Beale, as you saw on the previous slide. I'm a principal advisor here at CB, now Gartner. And the reason I say that is because I've been working at CB for a number of years, and we as an organization were acquired by Gartner last year. So we are becoming an integral part of the Gartner operation as we go forward. So I'm based here in London. I support our audit and our risk clients across Europe, Middle East and Africa. So we have about 320 of those, and I have a team here that works with me. And so I spend all day, every day talking to leaders of risk teams and also leaders of audit teams. In terms of the format of the webinar today, we're going to be advancing the slides. Hopefully everyone can see the page and hear me clearly. You can communicate with me if you want to ask a question. There's a box on this screen if you want to ask a question. We'll try and get to those during the webinar if we can. But if there's a lot of questions or they're very, very diverse, we're obviously going to be struggling to answer each and every question. But if I'm seeing some common themes coming through, certainly I'll try and get to those. We'll be advancing the slides and everybody's phone is on mute. So you won't be able to converse with us by voice, but if you do have a question, as I mentioned, there's a Q&A box. And I also want to make it slightly interactive, in addition to the questions, slightly interactive by I'm going to be asking you some questions, and you'll be able to see the results from the group that are on the webinar. Going to ask, I think, 4 questions early on in a minute, and then 1 question towards the end, and then also before we close, we'll ask your feedback and evaluation of the webinar and how useful it was to you. In the exec summary, I'll talk about the definition. What is an emerging risk? That's often a moot point when we're talking to clients. What do we call an emerging risk? What do they call an emerging risk? How long can a risk be emerging before it's emerged and it's hatched and it's a real risk? We'll talk about the logistics of the survey that we've done, and in that first section highlight the top 4 risks that came top of the pile. And then in the second section, when we get into more detail, talk about all the top 10 and various analysis of those top 10 risks, including some mitigation analysis as well. I've mentioned the further information. So let me kick off by asking you for your input on the 4 questions. So I want to ask you first, do you already have a process to scan the horizon and identify emerging risks? So hopefully you can see on your screen the question 1. Yes, we have a regular process. Yes, but it's not regular, but reactive to events. No, but we will this year. Or no. So please answer that. I just want to be interested to see kind of what the state of emerging risk processes are in the audience that we have on the webinar today. Okay, I'm just going to leave this open probably for another 10 seconds or so to give everybody a chance to answer this. So the majority at the moment, 50%, well not quite majority, but the biggest group here, 50% have a regular process. Oh, that's just changed, 40%. Okay, so we have a spread. So 42% say yes, regular process. 35% yes, we have a process, but it's not regular, it's reactive. And interestingly, 17% say no. So thanks for that. I've got a couple more questions I want to ask. So how do you identify emerging risks in your organization? For those of you that have a process, whether it's formal, regular, or more reactive, you do this in the ERM team. So the ERM team responsible for scanning the horizon, identifying emerging risks. You can. I'm asking you here which one is most applicable. So asking SMEs, so subject matter experts. Thirdly, we liaise with other assurance teams, so we also involve audit or InfoSec, compliance, etc. We use external brokers, external information, so surveys and reports from World Economic Forum, from the Economist's Intelligence Unit, etc., or other. Oh, sorry, I haven't clicked on Start Voting. There we go, that'll make a difference. So yeah, hopefully you can all see this now. So which is the most important for you in your organization? Expertise in the ERM, expertise in the business, liaising with other assurance teams, external information, or other. Okay, I'm going to leave that open for a few more seconds, give everyone a chance to click that, because I want to keep us moving. Okay, question 3. And having scanned the horizon, identified some emerging risks, what is it that you do with those emerging risks? So, nothing. It's interesting to find out what they are, but we don't do anything with them. We monitor them in case they become more likely, so they move from emerging risks to real risks. We review and update our controls and mitigation for those emerging risks, or we ask the risk owners to take action, or we do something else, other. So what is it you do with that list of emerging risks that you're identifying? And then I'm going to leave this one open again for another few seconds, and then I've got one final question at this stage, and then we will get cracking on the presentation. Okay, so let me launch the fourth and final one, which is about how often do you update your board about emerging risks that are facing your organization? We do it once a year, we do it twice a year, we do it every month, we do it occasionally as requested. So potentially if there's a major change or an incident or something, or never. So I'd be interested in your responses to this as well. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to capture these results and share them back with the group afterwards if you've not already been noting these down as we go through. All right, so the majority here are saying twice a year. Okay, I'm going to let this one run down for another 10 seconds or so. So twice a year, majority, or the biggest group, and then a good sized group saying once a year, and occasionally, as and when requested. But twice a year is definitely the majority. Okay. All right, thanks very much for participating in that. Let's move on and take you into the exec summary. So I want to talk here. Definition, as I mentioned, it's important to start off any conversation, I think, about emerging risks as to what do we mean, what is the definition of emerging risks. Talk a little bit about the logistics briefly of the survey that we did and the demographics, and then get to the top risks that we identified in Q1 through our global survey. So first of all, Some words about definition and logistics here. So our definition is in the top left of this page. Let me just read it out because it is quite important. It's a foundation stone for the rest of the session. So an emerging risk takes the form of a systemic issue or business practice that has either not been previously identified, or it has been identified but it's been dormant for an extended period of time, or has yet to rise to an area of significant concern. So that means it may be entirely new, or it may be a risk that we already knew about but was pretty low in terms of probability or impact, or probably both for us. For some reason, it's become more important for us in the near future. So that's our definition. In terms of logistics, let me read out a couple of things from the middle column here. The way we do this, we organize the survey with a global network from risk, audit, finance and compliance, and we ask them of 20 risks that we provide to them for them to vote on their top 10, which are the most significant emerging risks for them. So we do quite a bit of research ourselves before we send that list of 20 candidates out to them. If a risk gets voted to be in the top 10 for consecutive quarters, it's then removed because it, by definition, is no longer emerging. It has emerged. Anything that doesn't score well drops out, so the bottom two drop out. And we ask executives taking part in the survey to identify the top 5 risks out of that list of 20 that they're facing in their organization and estimate probability, a concept I'm sure you're familiar with, impact, again the second concept you'll be very familiar with, but also we ask about velocity. And I'll come back to this because I've got a couple of graphs I want to share with you which talk about velocity. But definition of velocity, for those that aren't already familiar with it, it's the speed with which you feel the impact. So you've assessed the impact. So if this risk actually crystallizes, an event occurs, so the probability becomes 1, how quickly does that impact that you've estimated actually arrive at your organization? So it may be like almost instantaneous if your online reservation system goes down. It may take longer if there's some other type of risk incident. So we ask about probability, impact and velocity. And we also ask the survey participants about leading indicators. How can you track these, not in the past, but track in the future, whether this risk is becoming more serious or less, and also mitigation strategies. And I'll come back to both of those, leading indicators and mitigation strategies, a little bit later on as well. So that's some definition as to how we run the survey. We run this every quarter. We publish the report every quarter. We run a webinar for our global client network every quarter, giving them an update on what we have seen and heard through the survey. In terms of demographics, you can see the spread here across financial services, insurance, manufacturing, etc. I should have said up front, my role is not to read out everything on every page. You can get access to the deck. We'll explain how to do that at the end of the presentation. And I'm not going to read out every bullet point on every page. I'm going to make sure that we focus on the key messages and the highlights. And I get the key learning points across to everybody, and you can read the rest of the material at your leisure once you've got access to the deck. So with that as a background, what were in Q1 the top 4 risks? You can see them here. I'm going to take a few minutes to go through each of those, but let me tell you what the top 4 are. From left to right, cloud computing was number 1. GDPR, perhaps not surprisingly, particularly for us based here in Europe, GDPR was number 2. Cybersecurity disclosure was 3rd, and global economic slowdown was 4th. Although I'll come back to this, but that's an interesting one because some territories, some jurisdictions around the world are starting to see the reverse of that, global economic pickup. But I'll come back to that economic point a little bit later on. So cloud computing first on the left-hand side, the most serious risk, the biggest risk that our clients told us about they were most worried about. So just a bit of background in the blue, which it kind of explains what is the risk, what's it all about, and then the text in the second half of each of those columns talks about what big companies, what best companies are doing in terms of risk management for each of those individual risks. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with cloud computing. Many organizations are migrating to the cloud, so putting more and more of their systems and their data into cloud services using cloud providers to run their systems, to service their IT requirements, and to store and manage their data. So there's agility, benefits, flexibility, and probably cost gains as well from doing this. But it comes with a lot of big risks that come with it around technology, but also around third parties and vendor management. And some of these things interleave. So if you're using cloud computing for storing personal data of your staff or employees, for example, then this would blend into the GDPR risk, which is the second one we're talking about. But clearly you're exposed if your cloud provider has a security problem or a breach. Then your reputation, your data, your client's data, your customers' data, your suppliers' data, your employees' data could be exposed. Your reputation is going to be damaged, as well as service and client service, ongoing operations. So a couple of things we're seeing best companies do, and with the space we can only summarize a couple of things for each of these risks here. Being very systematic about identifying what processes, what systems, what data you are going to migrate to the cloud and why, and which you are not. There may be certain systems, processes, or business units you say that is not appropriate to be in the cloud. We want to maintain direct control over that and the security that's alongside that. So definitely needing an effective third-party risk management process as well. How do you choose this IT vendor, if I could call it that? How do you select them, manage them, monitor their performance, get comfort over their security and their operations, make sure that their standards are as high as yours in terms of protection, but also incident management, disaster recovery, etc. Second one, GDPR. I'm guessing that most people are familiar with GDPR. It's been around for a couple of years since the law was put in place, and it becomes operational, as many of us know, by the end of next month. But our work with clients focusing on this shows that many are still have quite a lot of work to do. Let me put it that way. There's some things which they've taken action on, so appointing a data privacy officer, or defining the role. Many clients now have a person filling that role, but not everybody. And there are other key requirements of GDPR as well, about being able to identify an incident and notify the data protection authorities within 72 hours, etc. So there's a lot of focus on this. I think a lot of organizations are not exactly playing catch up, but putting a lot more focus on it now with the deadline fast approaching, sort of 6 weeks or so away, because they recognize there's a lot of work to be done. It's quite technical. It cuts across different parts of the organization, and potential for huge fines, as well as, of course, some reputational damage. So cybersecurity, the third one. And this happens to have risen up because of speed of communication. We all read about breaches, hopefully not our own organization, but other organizations, and it's big news very quickly. We would all have seen Cambridge Analytica or Facebook stories over the last couple of weeks. Very quick news. But interestingly, a couple of things on this, the risk that we see and hear. For a lot of organizations, their plans to respond to an incident or a disclosure are not as robust, not as fully developed as you would expect, or even in some cases non-existent, which is quite surprising. The other thing that we see, which is not actually laid out on the page here, organizations often do not identify that a breach has occurred very quickly. It can be, and again this is surprising, but it's true from our research, organizations cannot identify that their security has been breached and data compromised or indeed copied for several weeks. So on this point, it's not only your ability to respond and understand what your requirements are and who is going to respond and how quickly, but making sure you have a process and a mechanism to detect that you have suffered from a breach. And then the final one, economic slowdown. Debt's very high, interest rates very low. Some things are changing, certainly in the US with the tax breaks that have been introduced. The economy's starting to pick up there quite clearly. It's patchy in Europe, but there are some economic upturn that's occurring. But a couple of things that cause this risk to be so serious is concerns over if interest rates do move up, how is that going to affect your funding and the cost of your funding and liquidity? And secondly, how might that impact your consumers? Are your consumers going to find it tougher to carve out some discretionary income to buy your products and services if interest rates go up and the cost of their mortgages, etc., go up? So one of the things that we've identified is how do risk managers play a role to help their organizations make great growth bets, whether you're growing in a time of economic stagnation or you're growing in a time when the economy around you is also picking up. We know what efficient growth organizations do. We know how they invest in acquisitions and R&D and how they allocate capital expenditure and make innovative decisions. But what's interesting, we spent a lot of time on this last year, is what's the role of ERM in helping their organizations make great business bets. Many of you, I'm sure, are very focused on the downside of risk. A lot of ERM teams and ERM leaders are looking at how can we play a role in the upside, the opportunity side of risk. What's the role of ERM in helping their organizations identify opportunities and make the right decisions to seize those opportunities and grow the organization? Things like let's provide information that's useful to the decision makers. Many ERM teams focus on managing risks and report on how we're managing the risk of fraud, how we're managing the risk of a compliance breach, how we're managing the risk of information security. That's not how business leaders think. They think about how we're going to grow market share, how we're going to cut costs, how we're going to launch the new product or service. So aligning your risk information in the right vocabulary at the right time with the right people at the right forum, but aligning it with how they're thinking in terms of business imperatives. Making it very focused. Don't tell them about 40 risks that you're facing. Tell them about the risks they need to make decisions upon. So how do you distill out of all of those important risks that you're facing, which ones need to be taken, action needs to be taken on, as opposed to others which are, yeah, it's a big risk, but we're managing it well. Our residual risk is within our tolerance. And how can you work to avoid creating a feeling in the organization of risk aversion? Risk is bad, therefore we should have another committee meeting about this, we should seek another approval, seek another level of authorization, generally causing organizational drag through the ERM activity. So a lot of work in there helping organizations grow and make the right decisions. So those are the top 4 risks: cloud computing, GDPR, cybersecurity disclosure, and global economic slowdown. So hopefully I've described those well to you and also given you an insight, a little bit of insight as to how we're seeing ERM teams respond to those and help their organizations manage those risks as they become more serious on their radar screens and emerge or come over the horizon. So let's move forward and look in a little bit more detail. So I want to, in this section, look at the top 10. So get down to the next level of detail. We looked at the top 4, but what's just below that, those top 4. Look at it. Look at this data from a regional perspective. Is it different in North America compared to Europe? Look at it from an industry perspective. Are things different in different industries? And then also thinking about velocity, and as I mentioned, a very important factor which some teams consider, but most teams focus on probability and impact, those traditional dimensions. And velocity really changes the way you can think about risk, and I want to show you a couple of things where velocity is represented. So top 10 risks, here they are. The top 4 we have already seen. So you can see here what comes from 5 down to 10. You can see some of them are shaded blue and some of them are white. The blue, those with the background of blue, are external risks, and those that are white are internal risks. And I think we've got this particular quarter, we've got five of each. The reason we do that, many of you will appreciate this, is that your response will be different if it's an external risk compared to an internal risk. So that balance between where do you place your risk mitigation investments between prevention, detection, response, and learning and improving will vary if it's an external risk compared to an internal risk. So it makes it interesting for you, but also it can change the conversation as you present this to your risk committee or your executive committee or your board. A couple of other things that are on here, the way these are ranked, you can see in the middle we've got an overall risk score. That's a combination of probability, impact and frequency that risk was voted in the top 5 by our participants to the survey. So impact, probability and frequency, and then you can see we've actually called out frequency separately as the most right-hand column. Many of these will probably be reasonably self-evident to you as to what they might cover. A couple which may not be, and the definition of all of them are in the appendix to the presentation. But social engineering, for example, is the risk that sophisticated criminals use deception to manipulate individuals into divulging confidential or personal information that may be used for fraudulent purposes. Assurance coverage, just to be clear about that, the risk that the guidelines for disclosing cyber breaches become more clearly enforced, compelling organizations to release information much more quickly than in the past, which leads to an increased impact from a both reputational and financial perspective. I think the others are probably reasonably understood, but if you want to go into a bit more detail, as I say, the definition of each of them are in the appendix. So how does this vary by geography? So the top 10 you can see here, we've just on this particular graph just put the Europe and Middle East, because I think that's where most of the people that have dialed in will be based or working, but also for interest and comparison, North America there. And you can see it's the same top 10, but they're in a different sequence. So here, again, perhaps not surprisingly, GDPR is top in Q1, followed by assurance coverage and cloud computing, whereas in North America, cloud computing is top, and that may be Facebook and other disclosures which were around the time we carried out this survey, and cybersecurity disclosures second, and GDPR makes it in as a joint second in North America from a North American perspective. So if you're working for a very international organization, this is useful because you can present and understand and compare between one geography, one region and another, and you can understand if your North American colleagues are very focused on cloud computing, whereas your European colleagues are more focused on GDPR. So it might reflect what's going to resonate most in your conversations and at the committee meetings that you're running. Second way of looking at this is quarter by quarter. So this is the top 5. You can see on the right hand side top 5 from Q1 2018, and then top 5 from the previous three quarters. And you can see there's some movement, some things which make it in one of the top 5s but then disappear, but others carry on for a couple of quarters. Some move up, some move down, and some, I would say, morph as well. So you can see, for example, data privacy occurred in 2017, and now we have GDPR, which is not a million miles away. But you see variations on themes having some longevity as well. So that's the top 5, quarter by quarter. And again, this is interesting to see. You can compare and contrast what we're seeing globally to what you're seeing in your particular industry and your particular geographies. And then the next comparison is, and I've just got here a simple or a brief comparison industry by industry. We're comparing on the right hand side here banking and financial service industry, BFSI, and those which are not banks or financial institutions. We provide a more detailed, more granular analysis across a whole series of different industries in our full report. But for the benefit of you in this presentation, this webinar today, I've just included this page, which is comparing banks and financial institutions to non-banks, non-financial institutions. So there again, there's some similarity, perhaps not too surprisingly, but there is some similarity, but there are some differences. You can see for the non-BFSI, we've got 3 equal number 1. So we have cloud computing, GDPR, and the economic slowdown. And then number 2 is cyber security, whereas there's a slightly different sequence for the banking financial industry. So some differences, but the same overall top 10. So again, if you're interested in more granular breakdown, that's in our full report available to our clients. And then I want to come back to velocity, and here on this graph we represent the top 10. So you're seeing the same issues coming through on these different reports, but on this report we're representing 4 different dimensions. The location of the circle is based, as you can see, on the probability and impact. So probability on the vertical axis and impact on the horizontal axis. The size of the bubble represents the overall risk score, which is a combination, as I mentioned before, of probability, impact, and frequency that it's voted for. And then the color represents velocity, and you see very rapid, rapid, or slow. So we're showing 4 different dimensions on this graph, and we think this is a particularly powerful graphic. If you haven't thought about this concept before, I commend it to you. You might want to adopt the use of 4 different dimensions on a single page. So rather than just having equal sized dots representing each of your risks, change the size of your dots, change the color of your dots, and then you're going to show two other dimensions. So very, very powerful way of representing multiple dimensions around your risks, but in a clear and succinct and impactful way. So if you're presenting this to a risk committee who are not going to be risk specialists, I think they'll get this message very easily because of the use of color and size. So very, very impactful graphic that I would recommend that you use. Just carrying on that theme of looking at velocity, if we focused on those same top 10 and just rank them by velocity, this is how the top 10 are resequenced. So the risk that has the fastest velocity is that volatile weather patterns, whereas cloud computing is number 2, and you can read the others in that same sequence. So GDPR, for example, is number 6, and that's principally because it's coming, but we've known it's coming, and the likely impact of it as it becomes live on May the 25th is not going to be immediate. I doubt if anybody's going to be taken to court on May the 26th and fined immediately. So its velocity is slower than some of the others. I think what's interesting is organizations should be very concerned about risks with high velocity because they might be relatively modest in terms of probability, but if they do occur, or rather when they do occur, the impact that you've estimated will crystallize very, very quickly. So what's interesting is what's the relative difference between the speed, the velocity of the risk, and the velocity of your detection and response plan. If the risk is going to move faster than your detection and response plan, you have a very serious problem. If it's the other way around, then it may be a fast-moving risk, but if you're agile and nimble enough to detect it quickly and respond to it quickly, that will certainly lessen the impact on your organization. So you might also want to have on this graph to extend or enhance this particular analysis by saying, compared to the speed of the risk, what's the speed of our response? And have a sort of a net view of that velocity. And I'm going to bring that out in the next page. This is what we call risk meteors. This is a combination of impact and velocity. So for those that are fast moving, and you can see right at the center of the solar system there is increasingly volatile weather patterns, which was the highest velocity risk. But the size of the meteor indicates the impact. So this is extremely powerful. When we present this to ERM leaders, they find this hugely helpful as to a way to think about how can we best look at risks and deliver impact and generate the best conversation at our risk committees. And so adding in velocity and combining it with impact, as in this meteor graph, is a very impactful way of doing that. And one addition, as I mentioned on the previous page, that you could usefully think about here is how fast are we able to respond to these fast-moving risks, and therefore, if it's red, then the risk is going to move much faster than we are, but if it's a green meteor, then it's a fast-moving risk, but we at the moment in ERM judge that management are able to detect and respond to that risk quickly. Couple of questions from the audience, and thanks very much for these. These are emerging risks. So as per the definition that I gave very early on, these are being classified as emerging risks by organizations. So these are risks that are not crystallized for them, but they are seeing these as emerging risks. So they are either risks that weren't present for them before, and they've just arisen, or they were, but then somewhere they were dormant or very, very low probability, low impact, and they've become more serious, more significant in the last few weeks. Another question about many of these risks are IT related. Very true. How will these translate to operational or conventional business risks? Well, it's interesting you're making a distinction between IT and business. We see a decreasing distinction between one and the other. Indeed, we used to have separate reports about IT risks and if you like, traditional or business risks, but that distinction, from our perspective and from many of our clients, seems to be unhelpful going forward. That business strategy is so integrated to technology, and technology is so vital to strategy and successful operations, that trying to separate IT risks and make a distinction, this is an IT risk and this is an operational risk, doesn't really lead to a helpful conversation. So we don't make that distinction anymore, and we have just a single set of emerging risks, or a single set of of key risks that organisations are facing. All right, let me move on and share with you some of the insights that our clients have shared with us about how they are monitoring how significant these emerging risks are. So we're looking at some suggestions here for leading indicators and some mitigation strategies that our clients have told us that they are putting in place. There's a lot on this page, and I'm not going to try and read out everything, but I'll give you a sense of what's here for these top three risks. And our intention here is not to say this is the definitive list, these are the only leading indicators you should consider, but these are good suggestions. These are effective. You might want to take some of these and add in some more of your own, or adjust or nuance some of these suggestions in here. So thinking about cloud computing, let me take two or three of the ones that are in there in terms of leading indicators. The proportion of your data stored in the cloud, or the increase in the proportion of your data stored in your cloud, and what it is, what it was, what it is, and what it's going to be, perhaps in the next month, 3 months, 6 months. Any changes in the product offerings from your cloud provider, or the contract terms, now or known about in the future. Any changes, or particularly an increase in other third parties that have access to your data in the cloud. So you might be sharing access to your data with other key business partners that you use, suppliers, business partners. Increase in unauthorized employee usage or access to the cloud services. And the final one that's suggested here is the regularity of second line cloud access reviews, access rights reviews. So who has access to what, and how often are those access rights reviewed and validated and confirmed they're appropriate. GDPR, some suggestions here. Percentage of employees who participate in training on GDPR. I suggest the fact that people have completed training is a useful building block, but actually have they understood it is equally more important, and have they changed behaviour so they're working in a way that's appropriate. Percentage of business projects that are complying with GDPR requirements or non-complying with them, one or the other. And looking at your organisational history, how often in the past have you met all compliance deadlines? So for other compliance requirements that you need to meet in whatever part of the business, how good are you at meeting those deadlines and being compliant on time? Because you may be following the same pattern in terms of GDPR. And in terms of cybersecurity disclosure, a couple of things. Looking at how many events and breaches you are having is one thing, and is there a trend line there? Is it going up? Is it stable? Is it going down? Average time to disclose for large data breaches, either in your industry or from public information more globally, or from your own experiences. How long does it take you to detect and disclose? So looking at those two metrics. So there's some suggestions there for you to monitor how serious is this risk for us, and is the risk becoming more serious or less serious. Then in the middle we've got some mitigation strategies. Again, I'm not going to read all of these out, but there's a great set of suggestions in there. I'll focus on the GDPR one in the middle. So appoint a data protection officer, absolutely. Look at your breach response protocols. Do you have it clear? Protocols to who will do what should you experience a breach. Training, developing and running the necessary training, looking at privacy impact assessments. So what personal data do you collect, store, consolidate, transfer, share, and how do you manage that? What policies do you have? How often do you delete it? How will you respond if an individual says, I want to know what data you hold up on me, or they challenge the accuracy or the necessity of you holding that data, or indeed seek for you to remove it or correct it. So a lot of mitigating strategies that are being developed for GDPR right there. And on the right hand column, if you're a client of CB, now Gartner, you'll know about these things, but clearly, and I'm not going to read all of these things out, there's a lot of things that we can do to support you as you seek to understand these risks, develop leading indicators, and develop mitigation strategies. Yeah, interesting question. Coming quite a long question. So this is a question around, I think, internal audits, ERM, and the whole assurance activity in an organization. And we see a lot of teams very much focused on this to make sure the assurance activity is both effective but also efficient. Organizations have invested heavily in risk management of different sorts in recent years, so compliance teams, ERM teams, data privacy, legal, internal audits, health and safety, information security, etc. And what organizations have realized is that these teams are busy working away, but often in silos, so using different language, different vocabulary, conducting their own risk assessments, executing reviews, producing reports. And that's led to a couple of very big sources of pain for organizations. One is assurance fatigue in a business, multiple reviews, seemingly repetitive, taking time from operational management and their teams, and pushback and complaints. There's too many reviews, taking too much time, covering same sort of areas, and causing us to meet with these people, share information, and try and address their recommendations. So assurance fatigue from business. And the second is from more senior parts of the business, confusion, because there are multiple views of the truth. Different assurance teams, whether it's audit, ERM, and compliance, to just take three of the major ones, report on different cadences in different formats and probably with different styles. So audit might report on a red, yellow, green, and ERM on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how does a senior manager compare and contrast? So seeking for a single view of the truth, can you consolidate your insights and recommendations and conclusions? Not to average them out, not to generate groupthink. I mean, you can reach your own conclusions based on your own work, but use a common language, a common vocabulary, a common way of ranking issues and rating concerns. So we see huge amounts of work based on driving much better aligned assurance. Okay, thanks for that question. I want to move us on now, having given you hopefully a good idea of how we defined emerging risks, how we conduct the survey and the analysis and get input from our clients around the world across multiple disciplines and different sectors and different geographies. We do this every quarter, so we've just been walking through some of the pages extracted from our Q1 Emerging Risk Report. In about a month or so's time, we'll be reaching out again and we'll be running the survey for Q2, and then later in the quarter we'll be running webinars for our clients on the Q2 insight and sharing the report with them. I want to move on now to a couple of extra things here. I want to talk about how to build an emerging risk process. I've talked to you about the outcome of a survey on emerging risks we've run, but many of our clients we work with say, well, how do we build our own emerging risk process? Yes, it's great to get our our quarter by quarter report, but that's helpful. But it's, we want to build something which is specific and unique for us. How do we do that? Another question we get asked is, are there any public sources of information? You may already be regular readers of the World Economic Forum each year, or the Economist Intelligence Unit, but there's a wide variety of others, and I'll share some of those with you as well. And then I want to give you a little bit more, as we close, I want to give you a little bit more information about services that we provide, and I've got an update from the IRM about some new information that they have produced. Okay, so building an emerging risks process. You'll not be surprised, I'm sure, to hear that we've written a guidance for our clients on how to do this. Essentially, there are 3 steps, or I think there actually is a step before this, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But 3 steps. We've written a guide. This is the contents page from that guide. I'm just going to give you a view of what's in here. The step which I think precedes this is defining what an emerging risk is for you. I ran a session with a client recently, and we spent quite a bit of time taking our definition and just working that through as to what exactly do we mean by an emerging risk for this organization. Is emerging the right word, or should we say evolving? So let's use the right label or title and have a good definition which will be unambiguous for everybody in the organization, that everyone will understand the same thing if they read that definition. So it's important to have a definition. So then there are three essential steps. First one is scanning internally for emerging risks. A couple of ways for doing that. Certainly reaching out to senior executives across your organization, across your business, and also brainstorming with staff, so not just the senior guys, but more junior people as well. And there's lots of options for doing this. You could do it through interviews, and we've got best practice on great interviews. You could run a survey, you could run a workshop, you could do it into another organization we work with. A client has put in place a game where they ask people to volunteer to be part of the game. So people self-volunteer, self-select to join the emerging risk game. They're put into small teams. They select the risk area, risk theme they're going to focus on, and then they do some analysis and research and come back with a lot of detail and thought about that particular risk, what it is, how it might occur, how we might detect it, prevent it, monitor it, etc. And there are prizes for the teams that come back with the best analysis, the most impactful presentation, etc. And we also know clients that use technology, so you don't have to have face-to-face interviews, face-to-face surveys, and so on. You can have sort of a chat room type approach where each room is focused on a particular risk or risk theme. So a number of different ways to get that internal perspective on emerging risks, and clearly you also need to think about how frequently you're doing that. Then secondly, external sources. I've got a page next with some great suggestions for you to some external sources of information publicly available. Collecting industry peers, risk events. So if you identify peer organizations that operate in the same industry as you, through analyzing publicly sourced information, you can see what risks they are facing, either in their annual report, for example, or their incidents that are described in the public media. And then finally, subject matter experts, which, because this is in the second section, the external subject matter experts that you might meet at conferences, professional organizations, professional services firms and advisors that you're using, etc., whether that's auditors, insurers, legal firms, whatever it might be. And then the third thing is, firstly, you've got to document them. Out of all of those risks you've identified, there needs to be some way of filtering them out of all of those risks that are on the list. Which are the most significant and why? Which are the ones that you need to focus on and to report upwards? And how often and how are you going to communicate those to management? But also, what are you expecting them to do? What is the action that you want to drive on the basis of your horizon scanning and the compilation of your emerging risk list, if you like? And if you're updating it on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis or every 6 months, what action do you want management to take, or the risk owners to take, the business process owners to take? So you need to decide on some action. and then repeat, track those emerging risk developments. So do those emerging risks evolve? Do they fade away? Or do they become real risks? So they move from being on the emerging risk register to being on the real risk register. So that's in essence the 3 steps, perhaps with that first step of defining emerging risks for you, 3 steps to completing or putting in place an emerging risk process. I've got a final polling question that I want to ask you at this point. So we've got a few minutes to go, but before we get into the final section, I want to ask you, based on what you've heard today, what I've presented, the information we've got, what action are you going to take to revise your, are you going to take action rather to revise your approach to emerging risks? Yes, I'm definitely going to take some action. It's something I'm going to be thinking about pretty immediately. Yes, I probably will, but it's going to take a while to think this through and decide what action you want to take. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure yet. I need to think about it and discuss it with colleagues in my organisation. Or no. No. So I'm going to leave this open for a few more seconds. Okay. Thanks very much. Well, it's nice to see that no one voted no, so everyone's going to take some action. It's just a question of quite when they're going to when you're going to take it. So thank you very much for that. Public information. There is a wide variety of publicly available information. I've mentioned the World Economic Forum, which is very well known, the Economist Intelligence Unit, some of the Big Four and professional services firms also publish information on a regular basis, United Nations, various United Nations bodies, and they're all listed here, and in the material you can see these are linked, these are hyperlinked, so to take you straight to them. So there's a lot of publicly available information that you can access to get your thought process going as to what the risks might be that you ought to be debating internally as to whether these are real risks for us or not relevant for us or not significant for us. And then just in closure, just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into CB risk management. We provide services to about 350 ERM leaders across the world. We have a regular series for our clients of meetings, of white papers that we publish, benchmarking surveys, and data analysis that we do. We identify case studies in terms of best practice and run webinars. You can see some of the material, some of that is on here. Webinars coming up about business continuity, risk reporting, running a successful risk workshop, and as I've mentioned, the Q2 emerging risk webinar is coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Other resources that we're publishing in the near future: supplier risk management, an updated guide to risk rating criteria, scenario analysis, state of the ERM function. So this is a sort of look at how big are ERM teams, what are they focused on, what technology they use, what skills are there in the team, how big is your risk liaison or risk champion network, etc., etc. All those sorts of organizational elements that ERM leaders are very interested in knowing what their peer group are doing, and are we doing similar things, are we doing it better or worse, are we bigger or smaller, smarter or quicker than our peer group. And the other thing I mentioned on here, big topic of huge interest across the world, across industry sectors, about culture, risk culture. What is it? How do you measure it? How do you improve it? So risk culture is a big theme across our global network of clients. And then finally, from me in terms of the ERM piece, from CB, something that a lot of clients are interested in is maturity diagnostics. So how mature is my ERM function? And we measure it against these 16 or so dimensions that are here, aligning with strategy and performance, having great risk governance, managing the ERM process, and enhancing risk culture. Very simple online survey to complete and benchmark where you are in terms of what activities are being done well, how important are they or not, and how you benchmark across other organizations as well. And then these are the definitions. I mentioned we had the definitions of the 20 emerging risks that we had in the Q1 survey. So those are all in here. And then I have, just in closing from the IRM. Three things that I was wanted to mention to you, and on your page you should see there are attachments to each of these documents. So the risk agenda is looking at what is the future of risk and risk management in 2025. So the IRM is doing some research and launched a major project to look at what risk management is going to be like in 2025. And so you can download some information off the screen around that document on the Risk Agenda 2025. There's an exec summary as well as the full document. And there's a new IRM qualification, the International Certificate in Digital Risk Management. The IRM's launching next year. If you're interested in that, the syllabus and more information is also attached. You can see that on the right-hand side of the page. If you would like any more information, you can see there's an email address at the bottom, inquiries at the IRM. There's a phone number and obviously the website. If you didn't already know those, do get in touch with the IRM to find out more information about the way in which the profession is evolving over the next few years, the new qualification that's been launched, and also IRM's got additional training related to what we've been talking about today. So it's got training on horizon scanning, and you can see others there, scenario planning, long-term viability of organizations. So if you want to understand more about the training options and opportunities from the IRM, do please get in touch with them by email or phone. You can see the details down at the bottom of the page there. I'm going to put on the final page, I'm going to put my email address up, so if you'd like to get a copy of the deck, please do send me an email. Let me just put that up now. There's my email address at the bottom of the page there, ian.beale@gartner.com. If you'd like to get a copy of the deck with all of the material that we've been talking through, do send me an email. I'll be happy to send it back out to you. And then in conclusion, I need to ask you feedback. Yep, there's a feedback, should have popped up on the screen now. If you could just give us an evaluation of how valuable you found this morning's webinar. We're going to finish a couple of minutes early. Hopefully that's useful. Covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for the IRM for giving us the opportunity to present on emerging risks. And I've got a couple more webinars scheduled for later in the year. So I look forward to speaking at those webinars, and hopefully many of you will come back and listen to those topics. And those, I think, will be on the IRM website, and the details are on there as to when I'm reappearing and running another webinar for the IRM. So we're a couple of minutes early, but hopefully that's good for everybody. So thanks very much for participating and joining. Thanks for your questions, and look forward to getting emails from you if you would like to see the deck. And please do contact the IRM for more information on those areas that I mentioned in conclusion. All right. Thanks very much, and good morning.